Greetings, abstraction students. Welcome to week number 6. It's hard to believe that we are reaching the end. We can see the final our final destination in front of us. This week we'll be looking at Russian constructivism. It'll be an opportunity for us to think about the relationship of art to politics, the role of the avant-garde, the idea of the avant-garde, that art can participate in social and political change. And in the case of Russian Soviet constructivism, the idea that art can participate in revolution, that art's deep relationship with politics, with the state, with power, that has been a part of its history since the Renaissance, finds a new iteration. It'll be an opportunity for us to think about the implications of Malevich's paintings, his Black Square, his painting White on White, those paintings that are of nothing. And we'll explore how we're to understand those pictures and the context in which they were made and within which they were intended to respond socially, politically, aesthetically. And then next week we'll look at De Stijl. We'll look at the Dutch avant-garde movement that along the lines of constructivism was exploring the potential of purifying art, reducing it to its basic fundamentals, and also the role that painting would play in an integrated social aesthetic life. And then also next week we'll talk about the important role that the Museum of Modern Art played in writing a particular kind of history of modern art and the development of abstraction that followed a particularly aesthetic, stylistic trajectory, one that didn't pay as much attention to the more messy social, political dimension. And why that, and the important role that MoMA played in preserving the work in the face of the violent totalitarian regimes at the outbreak of the Second World War and after, and how the telling of that particular story in the United States is a different kind of story than one that was being told in Europe. And then the week after that will be the week that you'll be working on your final paper. And that final paper is around 15 pages. It will focus on an artist that we've talked about, that you want to talk about in more depth from a different angle, or to take some of the angles that we've looked at abstraction in this class and use some artists and works of art to explore that angle in more depth, or maybe select an artist or an angle that we didn't cover in this class. And also this week I'm assigning your paper proposal. So it'll be a 250 to 500 word paragraph or two that gives me an idea of the direction that you're thinking about exploring for your paper. I want you to be thinking about it now, so that the final week doesn't sneak up on you. So this question of the relationship of art and politics is an extremely important one, and it's too easy to see the development of abstraction in the history of modern art as simply a stylistic development, that the artist is just free to do whatever they want, and they're just innovating and expressing themselves, and they're doing it because they can do it. But what that ignores is the fact that artists are working within an institutional and a social context, and they are responding to that institutional and social context. And that as the history of Western art has developed since the Renaissance, the relationship of art to power, to wealth, to the church and the state, to authority, has been a very, very close one. And closer than any other art form other than architecture and sculpture. Architecture, sculpture, and painting require a lot of resources, a lot of time. They are singular artistic expressions, which means there's a particular artifact that a state or an individual possesses. It creates scarcity, which is very different than the poetic arts, the literary arts, the musical arts, which have a particular kind of capacity to be reproduced without that expense. Music, until the age of recording, falls a little bit into that, where you actually have to go to a performance. But in terms of poetry and the written language, those writings can be copied, they can be memorized. So this relationship between art and politics, that art needs politics, that art is entangled with politics, we see played out throughout the history of modern art. And the development of modern art presumes that art has an entanglement with and is an expression of church and state, between a religious theology and a political theology. So much so that when artists like Monet and the Impressionists and Courbet are innovating, their stylistic innovations, their innovations of subject matter, bring with them inherently political implications. And those political implications are felt by their initial audiences. And so the development of the avant-garde, the ideology of the avant-garde, this ideological engine that drives much artistic practice and certainly motivates the work of Malevich and others within the context of Soviet constructivism, is the idea that instead of the arts being the representation of church, of the throne and the altar, of the church and the state, of simply the expression of such power, is it possible that by changing art, by changing a society's cultural images, by reconstructing painting, that somehow it can serve as a catalyst for reconstructing power? That deconstructing painting and the painting's values can have a relationship and can catalyze and serve as an instigator for the deconstruction of unjust political structures. And that is what we have with the work of, say, Malevich. For Malevich, the idea of making white paintings or black paintings was a means of negation. It was cleaning away all of the inessential temporal aspects, problematic aspects of painting. Its habits, its particular forms that were attached to previous beliefs, political beliefs, religious beliefs. And trying to start anew, to create a bedrock from which to build painting again for a new epoch, for a new world. That a new world needs a new language. And this is not something that is unusual in the history of modern art. We saw this with Courbet from the very beginning. Courbet is asked, why don't you paint angels? He said, I'll paint one if I see one. For Courbet, it's the elimination, the scraping away of the mythology. He's functioning as a demythologizer of art. Instead of dealing in the nether realms of allegory and symbol and a kind of visual language of a spiritual world, he wanted to clear that out and develop a pictorial language based on a notion of reality that did not depend upon a reality that we did not see. And what is so interesting is by the end of the 20th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, it becomes that cleaning out art in many ways is cleaning out art to hold potential for what we don't see. It's clearing it out to make a blank slate, but that blank slate, that blank canvas is a full present canvas, a canvas awaiting a future. And yet, for Malevich, unlike Courbet, and what is so interesting in the development of abstraction, which Courbet is not. Courbet is not an abstract painter. It is to emphasize, for the abstract painter, and certainly for Malevich, it's to emphasize that the world is more than just what you see. There's something else. And that brings a spiritual dimension to political revolution. And what is so interesting is the kind of theology of the Russian Revolution, the theology of communism, the theology of socialism, of a belief in redemption. But that redemption is one that is initiated by, or it's a redemption that is completely imminent in our world. It's not a heaven that's dispersed, a reward that is deferred until after our death. But it's a living potential that we may be able to experience tomorrow. But the expression of tomorrow is an expression of hope, and it's an expression of it's an expression of faith in what is not seen. And so there is much talk amongst the theorists and critics working from a Marxist, from a communist, socialist perspective of a kind of redemption. And Malevich's work, he wants them to serve as icons. And it's not insignificant that Malevich and Kandinsky and some other artists, Matisse, are deeply influenced by Russian and Byzantine icons. And certainly for Malevich, it's to re-embrace his own heritage, his own experience of the theory and practice of icon veneration. that he wants his black square. He wants the white painting, he wants them to create a particular experience, an experience that's not predicated upon knowledge of Old Testament and New Testament stories or classical antiquity and those stories, or to know the sophisticated forms. But there's something else that he's wagering that these paintings will be able to serve as icons for a future. And the other thing, in terms of looking stylistically at say, Malevich's black square or his white-on-white paintings, is that after Malevich, there are a number of artists who paint white paintings or black paintings. Ad Reinhardt in the 1950s. Robert Rauschenberg did a famous series in 1950, 1951, and 52 of white paintings. But they're functioning differently. Rauschenberg isn't copying Malevich. Rauschenberg's white paintings are operating in a different register than Malevich's. And it's important to see those artifacts, those paintings, as expressions of responses to particular contexts. And one of the things that's difficult is going to, say, the Museum of Modern Art. What we're looking at is artifacts in which they can be seen as simply iterations of the same idea. But even though there may be stylistic affinities, but also there are significant differences if you're looking closely, they come out of particular contexts that are important for us as historians to keep in mind. And the revolutionary character of Malevich's work and its movement from a spiritual place, that it was going to be the spiritual, that it's going to be the recovery of the icon tradition that is going to have a kind of revolutionary power that is important. Now, on Friday, my Friday video chat, I'll take a deeper dive in exploring the icon and its implications for modern art and the development of abstraction. And in 1966, the Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky released a movie called The Passion of Andrei Rublev. And Rublev is the most famous icon painter. He painted the Holy Trinity, probably the most famous icon ever painted in the 15th century. Very little is known about Rublev. And Tarkovsky took the opportunity that Rublev's life is a blank slate to invent a life for him. And what is so interesting about this is the connection of this 15th century Russian monk experiencing personal crisis, going through a spiritual crisis in order to prepare himself to paint this icon. Now, what is interesting is that the Soviet government banned that film, and that Tarkovsky only was able to release it in Paris at the Cannes Film Festival. And what is interesting is that the government its response demonstrates the political revolutionary implications of Tarkovsky making a movie about a Russian monk and his icon. That the icon itself is not sequestered within the church as a kind of spiritual, completely bound up with political power, as the church would have been understood in the context of 19th century Paris, for example, and its relationship to the monarchy and the ecclesial structure of the Catholic Church in France. But that this poor monk, this 15th century Russian monk, was seen as a threatening political figure, and that the icon is a political act, an act of liberation, an act of declaration of injustice, and a hope in a future redemption, is really powerful. And I'll try to unpack that a little bit more on Friday. Hope these comments are helpful to you. Have a great week. And again, write me if you have any questions. I look forward to continuing our dialogue through email. Take care.